and positioning oneself as a mutual learner and holding social construction of reality lightly and holding others with respect and curiosity. So during today's discussion, periodically we will have a reflective process in which I will ask the panel if it's okay for us to stop and reflect. And the process of reflections are brief. They're held they are held lightly, the offerings of the reflection, and I think that that could add a lot of richness to today's discussion. So I guess now it's time for me to introduce our panelists. So Keith, would you like to introduce yourself and perhaps say maybe a little bit about what you're hoping for in this discussion today?
I'm Keith Wood. I'm in Atlanta, and been involved some with a open dialogue project that we have here, and looking forward to the power of dialogue, both our internal and external, and voices, and believe very much in the power of that, and I'm looking forward to having that dialogue happen with some others, especially around what may be considered racism or issues that are associated with that. I'm not sure what race is, other than a social factor. And so it'll be I'm curious, besides being opinionated, I guess, in some ways, and looking forward to seeing where the dialogue or the polyphony goes.
Thank you. Charmaine.
Yeah, thank you for having me. My name's Charmaine Harris, and I live in London, Stratford, East London, working across 3 sites: North East London Foundation Trust, East London Foundation Trust, and a third sector organisation called One Place East in Redbridge. I am a dialogical practitioner and work alongside Russell as part of the pod tutors offering the 4-week residential course. Really humbled to be here today and very curious where the dialogue might take us. So thank you for having me.
Thank you, Charmaine. And forgive me and please correct me if I pronounce your name incorrectly, because I'd like people to pronounce mine correctly. Razik?
Yeah, Russell Razak, yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. So thank you. Well, thank you for inviting me. As I say, my name is Russell Razak. I'm a psychiatrist based in London, England, and also an open dialogue practitioner and trainer. And I've long believed that while open dialogue, I think, can have a transformative effect in mental health and in sort of psychiatry and its practice, it also has a vital role, I think, in wider social, political, cultural issues. And I've long believed that really that's the way that we can have difficult conversations wherever they exist. And this certainly is a difficult conversation. And I'm really glad that we're starting to have it these days. And I'm grateful to be invited here today to carry it on. Thank you. I think you're still on mute.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to ask you maybe a question or a curiosity that I have, because I'm wondering what each of you, if you can speak to what your relationship is with race or racism. Like, how do you relate to racism? Or what have some of your lived experiences been?
I guess maybe it's ladies first, so I'll kick off. It's really difficult to think about these things, really, because I think historically, growing up in different areas, I have experienced racism in a number of different ways. Being of mixed race heritage, it was really difficult to fit in outside of my family. I wasn't black enough to be black. I wasn't white enough to be white. And so I guess it kind of, for me, felt like I was amongst another kind of minority of people, which I later found growing up. Probably some of these things have encouraged me to take up the kind of work I do now, really, thinking about that minority group of people, where we fit in, and kind of where we're at in different areas of my life today. But one of the most significant discriminatory struggles I've had is that question of myself, that internal dialogue as to my own identity and how I fit into discussions forums such as these, really.
Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, thanks for going first, Charmaine. It's not an easy thing to bring up, really, to talk about, which was I think demonstrated in the pause after you asked the question, because most people of color have some kind of history in this area, and I haven't, and often don't talk about it very much, and we kind of know we've all been through this, but it's like a shared sort of hidden background that never really gets revealed to other people, but we know it about each other, right? And that's been very much, the case for myself. I mean, my parents came to the UK in the 60s, and they never saw themselves as at home in this country because they never really felt welcome, that it was their country too. I always thought that I should feel differently because I was born in the UK, but my childhood was marred with many experiences of being rejected because of the color of my skin, and people crossing the road to avoid you, not being able to go out in your garden to play because of racist abuse as a child, and abuse all the time at school, and not really ever feeling like you're part of the crowd, you're part of the group that everybody else is part of. And that sort of throughout the whole of your childhood has a big impact on how you feel about yourself. Many years later, when I started to train in psychotherapy and have my own psychotherapy, I started to bring some of these things out, but it took a long time. And when I started to bring them out, I didn't realize myself how embedded they were in me. My inner voice to myself was very much related to those explicit and implicit belittling experiences that I'd endured through the whole of my childhood and subsequently as well. And they're still there. I can't pretend they're not there. People who know me see me as a confident person, but underneath it all, a lot of it comes from a reaction to that sense of not really being valued or respected as an equal. And that is, as I say, I know that's a broad experience that people have. And not feeling that you have a home either. I've often had that sense, and especially actually in the UK. I mean, there's different experiences of racism in different countries, right? I mean, the US is, for all its faults and terrible experiences, also is seen as a melting pot. Whereas the UK, you go abroad and people ask you where you're from, and you say, I'm from the UK, and they say, yeah, but where you're really from? There's no idea that a non-white person can be British, right? So, there's a lot of these things, I guess, that we carry around with us, and that leaves us with a sense of not knowing where your home is. Then you go to Bangladesh, where my parents are from, and I definitely don't fit in there most of the time. Can't speak the language a lot of the time. So, yeah, I mean, a lot of these things are ingrained deeply. And I hardly ever have these conversations with white people, I have to say. because I don't know how it'll go down. A lot of this links to British history and things like this. I mean, the Indian subcontinent, where my parents come from, had hundreds of years of rule by the British, and that mentality remains within a lot of us on both sides of that. So yeah, those are I guess, are my experiences, and it's true I don't talk about them very often. So glad to have a space, and I think these dialogues are all about a shared safe space. So thank you for creating them.
Thank you. So Keith, I'm wondering if something is coming up for you as you're listening to this.
Well, I just listening to both Charmaine and Russell, and listening to kind of even hearing myself in the midst of all this and responding to your question. I guess what's coming up for me is, I think yesterday I submitted a blog on, I'm trying to remember the title of it, but it was the criminality and illness of being Black. And as I was writing it, it really touched on the fact that how do I write the word Black person, and in comparison, in that kind of dichotomous way of also saying then white person. And just before I submitted, I decided that I would write the word Black in capital letters, and not use a capital W for the word white. And it's kind of an ironic kind of thing. It's like, why would I? And I went to myself and said, well, why would I do that? You know, and I think it's caught in that same matter of, I think, a question that people sometimes say, well, if you say Black lives matter, why don't white lives matter? And the answer is yes, they do, but that's not been a question. So I think in some ways, the capital B for me was to say that being Black is different than being white, in the sense of the emphasis, it is more than just a description of maybe a color or something like that, and therefore justified in my mind, maybe the idea of using Black, even though I am very much oriented toward people being people. And I feel like in some ways we've missed that. In some ways we've almost, I think in all our systems in some ways, even the idea of race and so on, which we don't really have much of a biological base for saying, or skin color, which I think people have used in some ways in different shades, you know, and all that. But I believe that the term Black has a broader meaning to it. And so in that whole sense, and brought up all those kind of issues. So while I don't know much about the whole idea of speaking to race, I do know that I've experienced, for me, you know, racism. And much of who I am is a function of that, in some ways, in learning to deal with that, even in the way to communicate, and I guess it's kind of, Russell kind of put it that bit about part of that has kind of shaped maybe who we are in some ways, in terms of negotiating and being in environments that may perceive us as being different, or sometimes, and deal with us many times in ways that feel what I would consider to be less human, to be more inhumane. And I think that, so I'm kind of interested in even in processing some of that, even as we talk today.
And And I'm hoping that a lot of that comes up in this conversation, even though it's difficult for us to talk about. And I kind of, to be transparent, got nervous when I asked the question about your relationship with race, and everyone paused. But I thought it was interesting to hear that you paused, not because you couldn't understand my question, but because it was difficult for you to even acknowledge, maybe, you know, or address rather what I was saying. So in that question that I asked, I'm also curious about, like Russell, you said that your inner voice was telling you something. I'm curious about what your inner voice was telling you when, in regards to talking about race.
Well, I guess that, you know, it's something that I suppose that the whole issue is brought up when you consider the subject of talking about race, right? So for me, experiencing racism leaves you with the sense that you don't necessarily have the same rights as other people, or the same right to be here. Right? It's not just sort of a general sense of rights, but the same right to be here, to be a person, that have a space, you know, on this earth. So to have your own place. Because when people live in, you know, if you're a white person in the UK, or you're an Asian person in Asia, or a black person in Africa, you feel like this is your space, right? But if you're in, you know, you're in a different country and you feel like, what is my space? And you're led to feel like you don't necessarily, do you have a right to this place where you are right now? And so I think that also applies to the idea of talking to people about your experience of race. Like, do I really have a right to actually bring this out and burden people with this and open up, and is this space allowed? So I guess that kind of came up from me when you asked that, and obviously it's been asked a couple of times recently, you know, in the context of all of this. And I think the good thing about what's happening now is that in order to change the culture and the dynamic that exists, which is huge, it's not going to happen, you know, in a couple of weeks, right? This isn't. I've heard some people sometimes talk about in some of the protests, those days are gone. They're not gone, right? And it's not going to happen quickly like that. But what's good about what's happening now is the permission to talk about these things and feel like you have a right to say them. That it's not a burden to other people to hear this, and actually it's necessary for this to be heard. And there was a blog just a few days ago by a colleague who's a senior colleague in the Royal College of Psychiatrists in the UK, and he talked about his experience of racism through his childhood. You know, it made some of us cry reading his blog. And he was a journalist, and he'd been to places where he'd experienced a lot of racism himself, personally, physically, you know, violence and things. And so, yeah, I guess that violence, you know, I'd also experienced some kind of aggression and physical attacks, and those things lead you to just stay cowed, you know. And so I guess the beginning of the process of changing is about being able to open up about that and feel like you have the right to speak, you know, about that experience, which has been kind of buried away for a long time. And I think for most people who've experienced racism, it has been buried away for a long time. You know, colleagues in my organization where I work, nurses, they experience racism not just in their past, and they experience it every day at work as well. It's a very common experience in the health service. People often do in the UK. And do they talk about it? Not really, you know, not very much. There are not many spaces for that to be heard. And a lot of it is because it's hard for the person as well. So yeah, I guess that's the feeling. The ability to share it is related also to the dynamic that it creates in the first place.
And I can relate to what you're saying, because it feels freeing for a change to be able to speak about it, because forever it has been the elephant in the room quite often, that we're experiencing racism or discrimination, and maybe we can't speak as freely about it. So thank you for sharing that. As you were talking, I was thinking about Charmaine, and when she said that sometimes she doesn't feel the permission to speak about race, and she sometimes doesn't feel Black enough to speak about that. And I think that's a very important voice, because there are more and more biracial people in the world now. And I would like to hear more, Charmaine, about what's coming up for you.
I think I'm happy to go into that. I guess as Russell was talking, I had to hold off from jumping in. I wanted to extend on saying, for me, it's also about a right to be heard. So gone are the days of trying to have these conversations. And I guess I'm here as a dialogical practitioner. So I thought that entering this world as a practitioner, my colleagues would be ready to have these conversations. And to some degree, I guess history is so traumatic that people shut down or shut off. Even in the best way, you try to raise it, to bring it. And I guess I'm going to drop a bit of a bombshell, but without naming someone else, a couple of colleagues and myself were noticing that with a particular client, there was only white people, as part of her network, as part of her team. And even when it come to them needing stand-ins, myself and some other people had put ourselves forward and said, I can jump in here or there, or, would you like to introduce or what have you? And then one of my colleagues that works in a separate team had brought it to an intervision and said, I'm starting to wonder if something's wrong with me because I'm Black. I don't know why I'm getting that feeling. And I was listening to her dialogue, and as she was talking, I could feel that then, even by naming that elephant in the room, as she was talking about earlier, Tashana, she was then trying to find a way to continue the dialogue, but in a way where it's kind of like, I hope I haven't offended. And it gave me the chance to come out and kind of say to that person in that moment, you're not alone in this. And I have actually been told by the network, it's nothing personal about you, but this person does not like Black people. And I can't tell you how that left me feeling as a practitioner. I can't tell you in that moment. And then I had to stop and think, and I was thinking, oh my God, I found myself in the position my colleague was in, and thinking, but people have a right to choice. If this person rejects me, surely that's fine. And then I was thinking, hell, goddamn no, this isn't fine. What is going on here? Do we not have a responsibility as dialogical practitioners to be very curious about that, to kind of want to understand that more, to maybe perhaps get that person to challenge that and work with that? And I was kind of getting this feeling that actually what we were doing was not doing that. We were actually working away from doing that by kind of just giving this person what they wanted. Fortunately, I now know that this person, I've met this person myself, and she's very keen to work with me. And she has been working with someone else too, another Black practitioner of mine. And thank God we found a way to open that up and kind of stick with that. But it was very difficult to tolerate for the first 18 months that we kind of was blatantly told, this is where we're at, So going on to what you're saying, Tashana, about how does this leave you feeling? Probably no different, from when I was 6 years old, and went to school and realized that I was different from other girls and boys, and that difference I just had to find a way to understand, as other people do. it can be a very isolating and lonely experience. Thankfully, I'm not alone, and thankfully we are beginning to challenge.
Thanks for sharing that, Charmaine. I wanted to come in there because, you know, it brings us to the issue of open dialogue and dialogical practice, you know, within issues of race. And I think certainly in the mental health field, one thing we often find is that when we're working dialogically, we sometimes end up finding ways to avoid the difficult issues because we want the dialogue to carry on and for people to be heard, especially when those difficult issues are coming towards the practitioner, right? But I think it's really important, and I'm really glad to hear how that then, you know, move forward, you know, to be able to actually address those things, perhaps reflecting amongst yourselves within the meeting, so that something that's difficult isn't then taken outside, but it's really addressed inside and being open about that. And it's easy to have dialogue when it's nice, right? When everyone's being nice to each other, but when they're not, that's when the dialogical process becomes really, can become a lot harder. And so I think that's where the challenge really comes about in dialogical practice, bringing up difficult things in those scenarios. And glad to hear that happen. And of course, it's even harder when the racial bias is occurring the other way from the team towards the people on the other side. And of course, as we know, and it's been mentioned in the comment section, that in mental health and psychiatry, there is a lot of that, right? There's a huge amount of Black people and people of color ending up in the psychiatric system, right? Because there's so much sort of implicit bias going on there. And you would hope that open dialogue would enable more of a conversation around that. However, not always, and it also is challenging for open dialogue too, because you know, there's still power amongst the clinicians versus within that room, within that network. And so that implicit bias needs to be checked by the people themselves, which is why prerequisite for working in open dialogue is very much self-work, a lot of work on yourself to look at your own implicit biases and judgments that you think you have or you think you don't have. And my own experience is very much that we all do have biases and prejudices, and I think the danger comes in when we think we don't. So it's being able to carry that awareness with us. And that's the work we need to do on ourselves in order to work dialogically, I think.
Another question I have is, do you think there is diversity in the open dialogue community?
So I'll just jump in there. I think that's a big no. And so it reminds me of a conference we had in London about 3 or 4 years ago. We have them every year, although we haven't had them this year because of coronavirus. And we have these very large gatherings of hundreds of people every year, of sort of key people involved in open dialogue, researching, practicing, teaching, and then people who are interested across the country. And we usually have 400, 500, 600 people there. And there's one meeting, and there's nothing atypical about this meeting. But the chief executive of my organization, we invite him to open up, and he came up to me early on, you know, white male, you know, middle class background, and he comes up to my ear and he says, "Russell, why so white?" And it's true. I mean, the open dialogue community, if you look at the practitioners and others, and then the people who are, is very, very white. And part of that is because it came from Finland, which is a very homogenous culture and community, and also the places where it has initially been practiced, including in the UK, has been in areas which has more of a white population. But that is not the only reason. There's more to it than that. And we have to do more to understand that. I think a lot of the language that it's described within, a lot of the culture that it's embedded within, does come from a kind of quite sort of European white background, and because of that, I think it doesn't necessarily connect. Although I actually believe that it comes from a lot of cultures, actually, you know, a lot of and indigenous and other cultures around the world. And I relate open dialogue, for example, to a lot of the way that people gather in places like Bangladesh, like where my parents are from. And actually, when people have a mental health breakdown, they have a dialogical meeting, right, amongst the family on the street. So it naturally happens there, but they don't use words like dialogical and all this kind of stuff, polyphony, and where, you know, we turn it into something technical, and then suddenly it becomes a culture of its own, which is very white because it's created, you know, a white community. So I think there's a lot of reasons, but is it culturally integrated, heterogeneous? No, no, and so we have to do work to understand why and try and change that.
And
Can
I'd
I
like-
come?
Hi, Paul.
Hello.
Okay, so go ahead.
You mind if I come in?
No, go ahead.
Okay, right. What Russell has just said, I think, resonates quite a lot with me. Because when I joined the 3-year meeting of Open Dialogue UK, I happened to be the only Black in the whole group. And in a sense, it was a little bit intimidating on one hand. And there were a lot of silencing of my voice, the way I felt it. Might be or might not be true, but I continue to insist for my voice to be heard, because I believe that my culture has open dialogue dimension from the very day I was born. Even as I'm talking to you, I'm hearing, I have the voice of my culture right here with me, telling me things to remember about the way we discussed and we had dialogue at home. And it ranges from virtually everything. When somebody is ill, when somebody needs support, when there is crisis in the home or crisis in the community, it's all discussed together. And a way is found how to deal with whatever issue it is. But when it becomes so dialogic in a sense, and formulated in a particular way of manner of speaking, then we are excluding certain people who don't know the lingo or the language, so to say. Okay, and that is one thing I will like to take from Russell's saying that we all have our own internal prejudices and biases, and we have to overcome those prejudices and biases and feel inclusive and included.
Keith, I'm wondering about you and what you're thinking about right now.
It is, I guess, my introduction to open dialogue was such the concept is so inviting. It seemed to be a whole approach of not looking at people in their differences, but actually using what I consider maybe the most humane piece about what makes us human. And that's largely our ability to use verbal communication and the dialogue and being able to, those interactions. And that it was so refreshing so that I wouldn't have to be necessarily seen as a being, as something less than human. I think to a large extent, I think many people who are considered Black or of color or something, have had to form a way of functioning and communicating that oftentimes we have not been the recipients of verbal communication. In other words, much of our policing system, much of our diagnostic systems and so on are really tied into what I would consider kind of racist kinds of pieces. And so what was so inviting to me was here was a way of saying, you know what, the way to deal with this, you don't have to beat something out of someone. You don't have to treat them as if they're more kind of using other kinds of, what I would say, the way you would treat someone who might be a wild animal or something, and you're trying to tame or something, which I even have issues with that. But it was just a really refreshing thing. I thought, this is really what a powerful way of being able to reach people and communicate. And it would seem like it would be a very welcomed, equating kind of way of dealing with people, Black people, you know, whatever. And it was just so nice to me. I was almost surprised with Charmaine telling the story about someone saying, well, that person's preference was they don't want to necessarily deal with Black, because does not do something personal about you. Well, that's who I am in some ways. And, you know, how is that? But in open dialogue, the problem isn't, to me, the problem isn't that the person's Black. It is the dialogue or the inner, you know, messages and stuff that we're saying. And what an opportunity it would seem to me that would be the reason for using such an approach. And in some ways, maybe even evidence of kind of a racist system within even doing what we would consider open dialogue by avoiding it. It's like, okay, well, we're gonna do that. And so that's been my experience personally. I can tell you that colleagues, I can tell you that I do a fair amount of, I work in a medical school, teach it, and when it's presented to people, it's like, oh no, that's definitely a very white approach. It is very much not something that you do, and even the language, and I know, and where's it called? It doesn't speak to me as a person. It doesn't all that. So I do see that it's a very, I don't know. I think philosophically it's very inclusive, but in some ways, maybe even the way it's practiced, and maybe part of it is the way it is even projected. I mean, the word, I mean, so much of it, the fidelity of the practice sometimes may not have the adaptation or pieces that go with that. There's another thing that I think is kind of significant in this, is that I actually think that people, I guess I'm using the word Black in this country, in the United States, there's a line that I learned when I was starting college that the statement was, Black people's blood is like the blood of Jesus. So this is this religious thing. One drop makes you whole. So it was like, we are all a big old mixture over here. You know, I do my thing with all that thing. But if you have one drop, in some ways, then you're Black, all right, in this kind of philosophy. But I think that growing up within environments where you experience that also teaches you a different way of thinking. So the logic that sometimes we might use in even our dialogical practices, we have to be very careful that we're not necessarily buying into a logical system that is based very much on a Northern European country or whatever else. I think sometimes there are ideas where you're actually having a different way of thinking. And so in some ways I feel like maybe the projection of even that into the philosophy or the approach that we kind of say when we're looking at open dialogue is making it more difficult to actually maybe accept it. But I do think by talking and by sharing and experiencing it, that is one of the best ways to kind of break through that.
Thank you, Keith. I'm wondering if this is a good time to have some reflections. What do you guys think? Are you open? Okay, so maybe we can have some reflectors come in, Diana Carlton and Candace Runis. And I would like for all the panelists to stop your video. That way we can fade into the background and allow the reflectors to reflect.
Wow.
Right. What a rich conversation.
I know where to start. What I guess we should acknowledge we know each other, and we're with the Houston Galveston Institute, and we're
Yes.
in the collaborative practices training program, just so people have a context for us.
Yes.
And Tushana invited us to reflect on what we heard periodically.
Yes.
So do you want to start?
Sure. So introducing it's Candace Runis, and I resonated with so many of the comments from the panelists. Sometimes I would become a little emotional because I could hear my own experiences in different things that they might mention. First of all, when Charmaine mentioned the idea of not being Black enough, that was something that I experienced later, maybe about 10 years old, when I moved from a private school where it was based in the Nation of Islam prior to that, where I had been taught that Blacks were very powerful and successful, and everyone wore suits and uniforms. And so my experiences were I belonged, I was part of this group. And then when I moved into a public school setting where the students in this school did not have those same experiences, I was very much an outsider because I felt like my gentle critiques of how to improve yourself, which were very accepted in their community, were not as accepted in this community. So then I found myself not being Black enough. And then I was moved to a private school after 3 years there, and found myself in a school where there were, it was all predominantly white. And I knew I didn't belong there. And so there were these different contexts where I'd find myself. So when she mentioned that really resonated with me, because there was this ongoing identity crisis of what does it mean to be Black. We have so many stories in this culture. Something Russell talked about is this idea of having confidence but not feeling respected and valued in a way. I could resonate with some of that depending on my circumstances, the comments that were made that you think, oh, you listen to that? You do that? And implicit in that message is, you're Black, you're not fitting what our expectations of you, and what the narrative is in this culture. The right to be heard.
Yeah.
That was a really powerful message throughout. I'm sorry, I will talk, Diana. But I think it's, I want to speak also to Paul's idea of the African practice of dialogical practices, but it wasn't named that. And it made me think of our even stories of indigenous peoples in our culture, where they'd have, I don't know if this is the correct term, but powwows. And they, as a community, would come together, the tribe would come together and discuss issues. And so that is something that's been ongoing long before it was named something. Yeah. So those are the many things that came up. There are lots of others, but I want to give you an opportunity to mention what.
Yeah, I'm just so aware I'm listening as a white person from a very different position, and just feeling a bit incompetent, because I could relate on the other side of it, and there was a lot of shame about that, you know, and sort of awarenesses. I wouldn't call new awarenesses always, but a deeper level of awareness. And I think the things that stood out for me, and there were many, was the inner voice of the early racial abuses, and how that it makes perfect sense, but how that sticks with you even though you become a successful, in everyone's estimation, a successful person, that still is with you. And that, yeah. And then a lot of sadness and pain. And, you know, I could feel some heaviness, but also some anger and like enough, you know, I kind of felt that too from the panel. And I loved, I think it was Keith's comment about writing the blog and how he put blacks in capital and white in small letters. I love that, because it's like, that's so symbolic of what's going on right now, and how white people need to hear that. And it's not a put down of being white, it's an acknowledgement of what we've all missed in the richness of other cultures, just by oblivious sometimes, and sometimes with intent, you know. The other thing I was thinking, I think it was Russell that talked about, I just took a brief note, so I may not get this right, but the space that you feel like in your own space if you're in your own culture, and how you don't have that space when you're in a different culture. And I was thinking, you know, as a white person, I think I carry my space with me. I don't think about it, somewhat. I mean, that it's not like all or nothing, but to make the point, like, I think I have the privilege of thinking, at least, that I'm carrying my space with me. I hadn't thought of that, and that seemed really wrong and important to acknowledge that. And then, again, a lot of comments, but the last thing that struck me was the nothing personal but, not wanting to refer to a black therapist. And I was thinking that, of course, has come up in my institute and my private practice, and thinking about how I handled it and just went along with it. Like, oh yeah, they can see what they want to see. I want a male therapist, whatever. But instead I could have been curious and challenged it a little bit. And I didn't. And I'm going to from now on. So those were the things that stood out for me. And I know I'm missing a lot, but yeah, it's a hard conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks too.
I'd like to invite the panelists back. So I'm wondering from you guys, as you listen to the reflections, if anything has come up for you.
The issue of being a black therapist or whatever, I don't look at myself as a therapist. I look at myself as a human being, and having a dialogue or conversation with other human beings. And for me, that is what it is all about, period. I haven't gotten to the grade of a therapist yet, and I don't aspire to be. I'm aspiring to be a human being. That's it. The issue of being, whether you are a black therapist or a peer worker in the therapy environment, or a female or a male person, always comes up. It does come up. And from what I have thought about is that we allow that to happen because we don't address it. We just brush over it. I could remember, Russell, the conference you were talking about in central London a few years ago. The issue of where is the position of a peer person within a therapy environment came up. and it was being discussed, and how to remunerate a peer therapist or otherwise. That was discussed during that conference. And I was appalled that that conversation was happening in that environment. It appalled me a lot because I have worked in a therapeutic environment where I saw myself just as a member of the community. And the residents in the community were center stage in managing the affairs of the community, in calling up.
Please.
All right. They manage the affairs of the community from calling for the 9 to 5 meeting in the morning, supporting their fellow residents, or calling for a meeting, even if it's at midnight. And those of us, the so-called professionals, we are just there as members of the community. We had no power as such. And I think it's about time that Open Dialogue starts thinking about this particular power differential and trying to level up this power issue. Not until we address it, then we are not doing open dialogue. I'm sorry. That is the way I see it, but that's my opinion.
I think what came up for me as I was listening to them is that I can relate to there not being a lot of Black people in the collaborative dialogic community either. And ways that I wonder, like, why? Because a lot of the culture of dialogue, like Paul was saying, does have a lot to do with the Black community and maybe even ways that I've been raised. And so I'm wondering, as I listen to all of you speak, how we can make that better and how we can have a dialogic community become more inclusive.
I think if I can take from Paul's piece that we work toward being more human in all our forms of communication. And it's such I can imagine it's a challenge because we are, to a large extent, what I see is more racist kinds of functioning is largely learned. It's become part of our culture. It is largely, we don't even realize it. I struggle with even the idea of, I work in a department of psychiatry, and I'm involved in, say, diagnosing individuals. And it's suddenly, do you realize what we've done? We've made a way of communicating pathological. And we don't even realize, we put an illness on it. And we use these terms that are all, and I don't know if we even think about it, because it is just the way we do things. But in a dialogical sense, the communication about those things is like to take that away and say, this person is experiencing a human experience. And in some ways, maybe hearing more about maybe why they may be experiencing this way, and maybe understanding, or maybe even, I guess I love this idea, some of the reflection that happens in terms of our understanding and what we feel in common with that, being able to relate to that. So it's not so much the abnormality of the person as maybe a consequence of the environment and the culture and the process that goes around it. So I think that to a large extent, broadening maybe the principles that we're kind of seeing with open dialogue is one of the best ways of doing it. And then I think it's more than the dialogical practice in terms of what we do in a therapy room or we do with these things. But I very much believe that this is a life practice. It is part of being human and being able to infiltrate more of our old culture, our old beings in the way we communicate, the way we deal with people. There's some discussion about, well, do we use this in policing? Do we use it in terms of the way we treat and deal with individuals who we have considered to have these serious mental disorders? Do we do it in the differences in the way we shop? Do we do it in the different ways that we talk to our partners? I really do think that the power of this really needs to be, the way we do it is to broaden it. It's a piece. And in many ways, it may even be beneficial. I can't remember who talked about it earlier, but beneficial to look at many ways where these principles have actually been used and have, but they're called by a different name that people can actually relate to where we're successful. I know that I do a lot of work with people who have been, people at the center of concern who have been called terms like schizophrenic, I don't know. But I also know that in people who are in groups, cultures where they actually have more kind of a dialogue kind of culture, that what in the culture where I am is considered to practically be a kiss of death. This is what you're going to have for the rest of your life. And one that's where people are treated as, oh, you're going through an experience and this is very much a human experience. And then this is something that collectively we're involved in. It's not just you. And in those situations, it's what some people tell me is, I had a nervous breakdown. It's over. They no longer have what we've considered schizophrenia in their minds. And I actually think that is, some of that is kind of what we tap into in this kind of approach. So when you say, how do we do it? I think we have to broaden it and maybe apply many of these principles and techniques and approaches throughout our lives. We practice it by practicing it in our lives.
I have another question about how do we make dialogue more accessible? And this came from someone in the chat. How do we have conversations? Because earlier we were saying how it's difficult for us to talk about race, but how do we make those conversations more accessible? Cindy, I'm wondering about what you're thinking.
Okay. I just want to say that I am late because I am having a lived experience of my son just being released from jail last night and not having the support that I thought I would have from the mental health community. So I may need to cut off at any moment now. I'm in a car, we are at the store, and things are unpredictable right now. When you said how can we broaden it, I was a little bit distracted, but my answer to this with what I was trying to follow is that I believe, someone said earlier that open dialogue has a broad base or possibility to be used in the community, and using it as a base for restorative circles where everyday folks can begin to gather and just add the twist of open dialogue, which someone asked, what are the principles? They had no idea. And, I can't name all 7 of them, but one of them is immediate response, not, a month or a week or 2 down, and 2 is flexibility, uncertainty, including the entire network of the family or whoever has called together. These are, and polyphony, hearing all the voices. I mean, these are basically the pieces of the village, like I believe it was that Paul said, or maybe not Paul, I'm sorry. And there's not enough practitioners, and there won't be, for the level of crisis that our society is in. And that's including Black, white, any color. I feel like every neighborhood needs a respite resilient house that also is coupled with a restorative circle, that it become as much a part of America as back in the day during World War II, I think it was, that everybody needed to have a victory garden. Our victory garden needs to be restorative circle with an open dialogue and respite house. And so we have to allow the training to happen at a more community level and not such a specialty level. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Cindy, for that. And sorry to hear about what you're going through, and thank you so much for coming to join us despite all of that right now. And I really, and for being so generous to come. And I really just loved what you said there about the idea of a restorative circle in every neighborhood, where with a respite house where dialogical conversations can go on. I mean, we think about what future, what world we want, and that's it. What you've described there, that's kind of it, right? Where we can all have those spaces. And you're absolutely right, open dialogue at the moment is a pimple on a pimple, right? It's tiny, okay? I mean, even in the psychiatric system, there's hardly anybody who even knows about it, right? And then you go to the broader society and nobody knows about it, right? So, and we are, of course, subject to and as Paul was talking about before, as you mentioned, Paul, in terms of the hierarchy and the kind of positions and the debates around these things, all of this is subject to all of the wider forces in society at the moment and all of the differentiation that goes on around that. So it's so hard to be the first bubble, if you like, in this sea, because you're subject to all the pressures around it that are trying to collapse it at any time. But we have to start somewhere, right? The first bubble has to emerge somewhere. But the first bubble is always going to be the one in most danger. And we're at a very tiny bubble right now. But I believe if we are to survive as a species, what you described, Cindy, is what we ultimately need to head towards, right? And actually those kind of dialogical spaces need to be how we govern ourselves too, right? A, about having those connections, but B, about actually, this is how we should be running our country and and our governments right now. It shouldn't be sort of a few people at the top making decisions for everybody else. It doesn't make any sense. There's a sort of hierarchy built into the way we run our politics and our governance. So we are a long way from where we need to be. We're just starting, but we really are in a very small space, and we have a very long way to go. And I guess we have a lot of allies to make, but it's good that we're in a time where there's some receptivity to some of these ideas, but it's just beginning. It's just beginning of that space, I think.
I just wanted to say it's also how we should be running our dialogical practice, our teams, our centres all over. We have to stand up to scrutiny too. Just so do as do the police and the governments and all this stuff. We need someone to govern us. We need people that use our services to say, okay, this is dialogical. This is what we want. We need people to govern us too, to make sure that what we are offering to families is dialogical. I thank Cindy for what she brought, and also Paul. They were two things that both stuck really deep in my heart. And at one point I was crying because I had the opportunity to help a Black man that come a long way on a long struggle from Nigeria, and he went a long route round to get to the UK, a route where he endured slavery, a route where he had to swim seas, a route where he had to go through France, a route where he was made to phone his sister, and he was electrocuted down the phone for money that the family couldn't afford to give. And when he got here and he finally got support, he said to me, Charmaine, I'd love to do what you're doing. And I had the chance, the opportunity, because I'm in the business of managing peer workers. But I knew how traumatic his life could be, had already been, and I knew what it could be like if he was to step in this work now. And I thought, yeah, we've got another few years, I'll get him in. And in November, he hung himself. So when I hear people like Paul talk, I know what sits with me, and I know that there's more I need to do, but we can't do this alone. This is a struggle that we're having in dialogical practice. I'm sorry, I just felt the need to share that.
Thank you, Charmaine, for bringing up that matter. It's something very close to me. I can relate to that a lot because I worked with refugees for 5 years, and I did a project on why refugees, when they arrive to the land of their hope, and yet still feel the need to kill themselves. It's something that really brought tears to my eyes as you were talking about it. I had to leave that job because it became too much for me to cope with. Even when I was trying to write my thesis, it was so difficult to get information about these deaths in prison. And it really broke me. And I can imagine being a parent, being a brother, being a father, or relating to that particular person at that point in time when they are going through that hardship. I went through war as a child soldier, so I know what it is to be a refugee, to run away from my home and go and look for solace somewhere else, even though I didn't have that solace. And when I had the opportunity to give it to somebody else, I tried my best to do it. And yet, like Russell said, we have the structure holding us hostage to be able to do the job of humanity and be human. I had experience of going to manage a PQ ward in a forensic environment. And I decided that I will take the experience I had from the therapeutic community into a PQ ward to stop, control, and restrain, to stop the use of seclusion, and work with humans as humans, and sit down and give them a voice to tell me what has been wrong in my practice, what I have done wrong the previous day, and what I can do better the next day. We tried and managed this because I was in a position to enforce it. We managed it for 12 good months. And within that 12 good months, we had only one seclusion and one restraint. And unfortunately, that restraint put a nurse out of nursing up till today. And what I'm telling you happened as far back as 2005, 2006. And that nurse has never been able to go back to work. And these are one of the disadvantages of going to restrain somebody. A human being, you take away their freedom and lock them up. For me, it's intolerable, because that whatever is the matter can be talked about. We can discuss it as human. And I allow myself to hear them, how they feel about being in that enclosure and being watched like animals and not human beings. But again, that is the system. But even when we are in that system, we can bring ourselves to the level of humanity and relate to people on that level. Because it's about relationship. Whether that relationship is in a closed house, or that relationship is out there in the community, or that relationship is within the prison, it is relationship. And we don't know when the coins can flip and where we will find ourselves. That's me.
Cindy, I'm wondering if there's more you'd like to say? You're muted, Cindy.
There. I think, like all of the panelists, there's just volumes to speak. I guess just to kind of second what Paul said, I had a choice when my son's lawyer called of being released at the time wasn't an option, but the choice was rather to keep him in jail or send him back to the state hospital that he has been multiple times. And I cried inside because that wasn't a choice, really. What happens at the state hospital is tantamount to torture as in the jail. It's just a different form. And so I chose the jail because at least he'd be 15 minutes closer, even though I can no longer visit him because of COVID, instead of 2 hours. And he would be safer, assuming that the guards didn't attack him, because in the hospital, with the dehumanization and the drugs that cause aggression, and especially the hospital where I'm at in Washington, there would be a great possibility that he would be attacked again and again. I am so at loss at how I think we can't depend on the state for funding. My son earned the state about $60,000 because in Washington, and I would like you to look this up, it's called the Trublood Case. And it was the federal court took the state of Washington to task because they were having people backed up in jail waiting for just a competency evaluation up to a year. And those people would end up often in solitary confinement, and many would take their lives or self-mutilate. And so the federal court said, okay, we're going to start charging you $1,000 a day when you keep these folks in jail. They put something kind of benign saying you're denying them their due process. Well, basically, you're denying them their life. No. My state in 2 years ended up owing $88 million. And when that settlement came out and they got to decide who got that money, the people whose blood and bodies paid for that, so to speak, got not a penny. And my son coming out of jail yesterday was supposed to have be a recipient of some of the services that they've implemented, including giving the police $325,000 to get better trained. I get so angry, I'm sorry. And this is an open, well, it is open dialogue with me being not the practitioner so much, but as a person. But it's like, whenever there's money because of damages, it just gets passed around in the circle up above. My son didn't get a penny of that, yet he earned at least 100 days of being locked up without due process. And this time he's done it again. But now because of COVID, you know, they don't have to pay the price. So we, the people, need to make it happen, and maybe it'll be rough at first, and hopefully there'll be folks that are more practiced that can keep guiding us. But it's got to be soon, or it's going to be too late.
Thank you for sharing that, Cindy. Russell, I know you've been, I'm curious to hear if you have any more thoughts or what you're thinking about right now.
Well, I guess right now I want to put my arms around Cindy. Hearing what you're saying, you know, there's so much to take on board. I mean, well, you know, the extent of the maliciousness and violence this is what happened with George Floyd, right? People got to see it because it was happening, but for the first time, people got to see the whole, you know, the whole thing happen, even in the space of 10 minutes. And I think this is why, you know, what you're describing, Cindy, these kind of things are happening because it's happening quietly, right? I mean, what you describe is huge, right? And yet, I've never heard of this. And how many people even in Washington State have heard of this, right?
They don't,
I mean,
they don't.
Yeah, and yet it's huge. I mean, you talk about $88 million, meaning that's 88,000 people. If you just do, I just did the math quickly, who have been victims of this, just in there. So, you know, it's beyond belief that the layers and levels of this, the extent of this kind of violence and oppression is, this is the thing about this moment, really, that people are, there's a little bit of the curtain is being opened a little bit, just a bit, not very much, because there's so much of it, right? But we get to learn about things like this, and it is, what I've said before about this is that it is right that we feel uncomfortable, and it's right that we feel what some of your pain, Cindy, but it's also right that as a society, the first phase of change has to be to be present, right? And to be present with your experience right now is vital if we're to do anything about it, right? Just to feel what it must be like as a mother to have your experience. And for the thousands of others, and then the thousands of many other experiences like this, before we rush to invent policies and you know, activism, I think it's really important to be present with these experiences. You know, that's the first stage, those dialogical pockets you talked about. That's the first thing that we need to do. And I'm really grateful to you for enabling us to have some of that presence with some of this pain right now. So thank you for that.
I would like to say something very quickly. I have a website. It's called regroundinglove.com. And my son's story was written about extensively, if you want to hear it. And it's you have to, there was a fundraiser page, so you actually have to, don't be afraid to click on the GoFundMe, because in the story of and my son is getting back in the car now, it tells of his story, which is the story of many, but also of Black folks, because we are targeted. They'll take in anybody they can in the dragnet, but okay, so we're talking about race. I'll just say that. And I would invite people to read his story, and you're welcome to write me. There's an email that at the end where contact, and at Rethinking Psychiatry, they give me my information. It's a pretty horrific story.
Yes, Charmaine, I'm wondering if you're having any lingering thoughts.
I am. Like Russell, I wish that I could comfort Cindy. You may hear an ice cream van outside my house. I guess we share a similar struggle, Cindy. I've had problems with one of my boys. So I guess what you're saying really resonates with me. But I'm also thinking about just the work I do, just the place I go, just when I step on the wards that I work in, what is hugely populating them? Black lives. Black lives. And that's why this is just such an important discussion to have, because we see it all the time.
Yeah.
How do we get Blacks to be more open to discussing mental health?
I think you take out the word mental health and you ask people what's working and what's not working. And as a community, we can see what's working and what's not working in our community by listening to what's not working in people's individuals' lives. We have good reason to be afraid of mental health, starting with drapetomania, when running away as a slave was considered a mental illness. We have reason to be afraid of the medical system, syphilis experiments, the sterilization. I mean, we could go on and on. So I think we need to drop the labels of and to say what's working and what's not working. And if someone seems to step way outside of what we think is working, that they're the messenger. They're the messenger. And we need to listen to their voices and what they have to tell us and how we can make a better future for all of us. Yeah.
I'm struck with how all this, I don't even know how to even talk about it. I feel like I'm fumbling with words because there's so much that really being touched. A large part of what you're going through, Cindy, and your story with your son, and in some ways it's I would love to believe that this was an exception, but unfortunately I know too well that this is a system-wide issue, and in how many ways maybe the difficulty we have even talking about it. And I really am impressed that this conversation is happening now. And the difficulty about talking about it is in some ways our difficulty in even dealing with it. All our own emotions, our feelings, our sense of responsibility, our questioning our decisions, and understanding, and even questioning the fact that we might supposed to be experts on something that we really aren't, and then buying into that whole thing, and how dehumanizing so much of what we're doing is. I grew up and I really became a person who was, as a young, I decided to become a vegetarian when I was 11 years old because I didn't believe in, I went to a slaughterhouse and saw them kill a cow. I mean, shoot in the head. And I just said, oh, I could never do that. And I kind of grew up with this whole idea of not doing fine with people and so like that. And when I was 19, I didn't get in fights and went through high school and stuff. And I'm like one of those exceptions of people always knew I was going to be this kind of person who always was trying to talk through things and understand things and so on. And never cursed, never did all those things. When I was, part of me I was called 85% soul, and that shows you how old I am. But I wasn't 100%, I wasn't told in those days I wasn't 100% Black because a lot of things I didn't do. And then at 19, I was in college, and I was, during the summer, I worked selling children's books, religious selling books, and was taught that, you know, if you're going to make money, you need to sell it in a white neighborhood. And so that's what we did, and was doing that. And I was in the midst of making a sale in someone's house, and the police came in, and I was identified and brought out when I came out the person's house with my stuff still in the house. And there were a number of policemen with guns pointed at me. And I had no idea of what was going on. And they had ransacked the car. All I had was religious books in it. But I ended up being taken to jail. And they had handcuffed me, and I didn't understand that and stuff anyway. But first time having any of these kind of experiences, and in the process, I was thin enough at that time to pull my arms around and actually brought it up to the front. So when they came in to book me, I had my hands in the front instead of behind my back, and a policeman came up to me and confronted me. And I don't know in my life if I ever I felt a sense of rage. And I didn't curse, but I remember his name, Dinker was his last name. And I told him to get out of my face or I would beat him. I'm 19. It sounds totally out of my character. It was so foolish. It was not something that I would teach my child or somebody else to do. And saying, how many people who've never had any kind of issue like that, the situation actually had me acting in such an abnormal way. And the reason why I was picked up is because it was because of, you know, in those days I had hair all over my head. I had an afro, and I don't know if you can get past race, and I don't know that you can get past the labels that go with that. And I don't know that you can get past that not being part of the narrative of who you are. Yeah. And so I understand when you were talking about, what does it do when you lock somebody up? They're having some problem, they're having some issue, and you start off with locking them up. I'm in Atlanta, and I feel like I'm talking too much, but we just had somebody who was in the midst of all the George Floyd issues. The policemen I don't know how they did this. They went and shot a man. And the issue came when they decided to put cuffs on him. And he fought against that. He was talking fine before that. Just the way we treat people. And that resulted, by the way, in Rashad Brooks being killed. How does that happen? In my logic, I'm going, if I was a white policeman during this time, I'd rather take a bullet than to do something like that during that time. That's in my logic. That's what I would understand. That's not the system in which we are in. And in my logic, I wouldn't, my rationale would say, the safety is don't confront. And here I am, but I understand. I'm 19. This policeman confronts me about having this thing, and I'm feeling like I have that instance. If I was more rational, I guess I would say I shouldn't have done it, but that's where I was, and that's what I felt. And if we understand that much of what people do is a function of the situations in which they are. And much of the way we treat people is not as people, not to talk to them, not to understand, but we end up we make them criminals, we make them mentally ill, we make them something else. And then what we end up doing is blaming that person. And I just think it's a terrible thing. You think that when you talk about her son being possibly in solitary confinement, isn't it interesting that, it sounds like it'd be better to be in jail than to have to go to a mental institution. And what a tough thing when those are your options. That's it.
Keith, thank you very much. I think that's maybe a good place to stop. We're out of time, but I think and I'm hoping that we can continue this conversation, because I think there's a lot more dialogue to be had.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing and for inviting us today and for holding this space. Thank you for your final words, Keith. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I'm so glad that I did join. I was thinking of pulling out, so thank you. I'm glad that I was here to experience this with such wonderful panelists, and what a grand job you did as well, Tashana, so thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tashana, and Russell, thank you for coming in, because we weren't sure when we were talking about it 2 days ago whether you were going to be here or not, but it's nice to see you. Cindy, thank you very much for sharing. Very courageous of you, and I feel for you. Thank you. Kate, thanks.
I want to thank everyone, especially the people who encouraged me to come on, despite what was happening, because I didn't think it was, okay. So, and now I know it was necessary. So thank all of you. And yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree. I think when we talked a little earlier, it's like, what are we going to do? What is this?
We have to do it again, huh? Yeah. That's fine.